Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, History Hit video, great channel. Let's learn the real reason France collapsed so quickly in World War II. I would love to know the answer to that question. My name's Connor. If you're new, hope you guys are all doing well. The original link to the video, top of the description. Let's go. If you're not ready to learn, you're in the wrong clip. Just sit in the back. Let's go.
Just before dawn, on the 10th of May
Dan Snow, legend. Sorry.
Just before dawn, on the 10th of May 1940, the largest concentration of motorized vehicles in history roared into action. After months of quiet, it was the start of Hitler's invasion of the West. What followed next was devastating, a stunning combination of new tactics and new technologies. Hitler's generals didn't just launch a massive attack into Western Europe, they launched a new era in the history of warfare.
Blitzkrieg? Well, mechanized blitzkrieg, right? But blitzkrieg, lightning warfare, essentially just starting quick and pushing far into, units far into your opponent's territory. I'm sure that's nothing new. But mechanized blitzkrieg, with tanks and all of it certainly is a new thing, right? But
Britain and France
the concept
were left
behind it,
reeling. Rarely have two mighty
old,
imperial
right?
powers been so completely defeated in such a short amount of time. Within 6 weeks, France signed a humiliating armistice. The continent of Europe was effectively in the hands of the Nazis. And Britain and her empire stood alone. It was 6 weeks that led to the conquest of Western Europe.
Imagine too that the fact that just like 2 decades prior, you had been very recently just defeated the Germans in an enormous war. And then just 2 decades later, they're rolling through your city. The whiplash that must have caused.
It was 6 weeks that led to the conquest of Western Europe. 6 weeks that shaped the course of the 20th century.
All right.
Undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
In September 1939, Britain, France, and their possessions across the ocean.
Sorry, how do you guys view Chamberlain? Do you think he's put a little? Do you think he's treated a little unfairly as being the guy like famous for like, all right, peace in Europe? Oh wait, he's just doing what I thought he just agreed he wouldn't do. And invading, was it Czechoslovakia? I think they just agreed over. But do you think he's just like the person that would have failed no matter what, or do you think that Chamberlain is due his sort of fame in history as being that guy who thought he? You know what I'm trying to ask is, do you think he's treated unfairly, or would someone else have done it differently?
Declared war on. In September 1939, Britain, France, and their possessions across the oceans declared war on Germany in response to Hitler's invasion of Poland. By the end of the month, almost 150,000 men of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, had landed in France to bolster the massive French army. These French forces began to probe into Germany's lightly defended western frontier. Hitler was deeply concerned that he would face all-out war on 2 fronts. But outmoded French tactics, which relied cautiously on heavy artillery cover, slowed any invasion of Germany to a snail's pace. The French attack paused, and with the rapid collapse of Poland, French troops are withdrawn as German reinforcements from the east flooded back west. With the conquest of Poland now complete, and with his agreement with Stalin in place, meaning there was no threat from the east, he could turn his attention to the west. But that would be a very different proposition. Hitler was desperate to avoid the fate that had met Germany in the First World War, getting bogged down in a war of attrition, stalemate, trenches that stretch from the Channel coast to the Swiss Alps. So he wanted a quick, decisive victory. But how could he do this? Because he had less tanks, guns and men than the Western Allies.
The Ardennes.
Hitler and his generals spent the winter months in a feverish back and forth about the best way to mount their offensive.
I would love to know the lapse in the capability of the German tanks to go through the Ardennes and the French assumption that you couldn't go through the Ardennes. Like, were just the German tanks more mobile than others, or was it a miscalculation by the French to not fortify the area more?
The success of the German campaign against Poland the previous year persuaded Hitler to listen to the urgings of his more aggressive generals, most proponents of the new blitzkrieg. What he agreed to was one of the most daring and unorthodox operational plans in military history. Deployment Directive Fall Gelb, Case Yellow.
Fall Gelb.
The plan would see the Germans start their attack along the same route that their fathers had taken in 1914. A big sweep down
refugees
through Belgium, looking to drive into France through the Pas-de-Calais. Just like 1914, the Germans expected the Allies to march forward to meet them on the fields of Flanders. Except this time, once the Allies had committed their best troops in the north, the Germans would launch a massive surprise attack through an area known as the Ardennes. The Germans knew the French believed this area was impenetrable to large-scale military operations, and so it was only lightly defended. The powerful Maginot Line ended some 20 kilometers to the east of the sector, and the men on the line were older, B-class divisions, underarmed and underprepared. The German commanders wanted their armoured spearhead to crash into France through this flimsy border, cross the Meuse River and drive hard all the way to the Channel, roughly following the Somme River. The speed of the action would trap the Allied forces in a pocket that could then be crushed by the advancing German forces.
Two questions. One is, did they have to time it right? Like, did they have to, like, get notice of how far the, you know, in the kind of fake you did to repeat World War I positions and draw them in here for you? How did they know, like, reconnaissance planes to be like, all right, yep, the forces are in here. Now you can encircle them without the worry of encountering them as you're encircling, right? And my second question was, I've been holding it off because I don't know if he's going to go into it more. It doesn't seem like he is. Why is it that they thought it was naturally impenetrable? And so how were the Germans so confident? Like, no, it is penetrable. Like, where that's so huge, and who was right? Did someone have better knowledge or something? I mean, you just had an enormous war on this border 2 decades ago, so it's not like... Okay,
in a pocket
those are my two
that
questions.
could then be crushed by the advancing German forces.
Oh, sorry, my third question also is, how do you know you're reinforcing enough at the speed that your blitzkrieg is going to encircle them? How do you know that you're enforcing it enough so that they can't, like, break through when you're trying to encircle?
Forces
Sorry,
in a
all right.
pocket.
Any answers would be great, guys.
The
You're
speed of
always
the
really
action
good
would
with
trap
that.
the Allied forces in a pocket that could then be crushed by the advancing German forces. It was an audacious plan. It was a risky plan. The Ardennes is a steep, hilly piece of countryside, heavily forested with narrow
here he is.
roads winding through it and deep ravines with fast-flowing rivers at the bottom. It's not good territory for blitzkrieg, which involves spreading out, bypassing strong points, surrounding and destroying them. If the Allies found out the Germans were moving through there, they could turn these narrow avenues of advance into killing zones with aerial bombardment and artillery. But it could also be the quiet back door into France. It was risky, Hitler decided to go for it. As winter turned to spring in 1940, the German army began assembling a vast strike force, right along the German border, facing the Low Countries and France. Nothing like it had ever been seen in the history of warfare. The German armies bristled with modern tanks like the Panzer Mark III and IV. They were outnumbered and outgunned by French tanks like the monster B-1. But what they lacked in firepower they more than made up for, with better speed, optics and communications. These would be decisive if Fall Gelb was to succeed. The Allies now knew that an invasion of the West was a question of when rather than if. French planners had long discussed the best way to defend against a future German attack. By 1939, those discussions had evolved into the Dial Plan. Allied forces would dig themselves in along the Dial River in Belgium. This plan allowed for British, French and Belgian troops to link up with the friendly Dutch forces and defend together against the most likely route of German invasion. The biggest issue that France and Britain faced, however, was the staunch neutrality of Belgium and the Netherlands. This plan relied on total cooperation, but until Nazi Germany invaded and the Belgians and Dutch asked for support, the masses of British and French troops could do nothing but wait on the French border.
It makes sense. I can never really criticize nations that are much smaller and less capable than other stronger militaries and that are at the mercy of of Germany. It's like, okay, well, if we commit for you right away before there's an obvious German attack, then then the German response will be much more serious, and so whichever countries in Europe kind of, or most, I guess I don't know the story of all of them, that kind of side with the Germans out of fear for their own country's protection, it's hard for me to blame them, because a country like even France, or especially like Britain, or even more so like America, you have the luxury of not having to worry about immediate destruction, like states like the Baltic states or the lowlands do.
Troops could do nothing but wait on the French border. It meant that the solid defensive line on the Dial could not be prepared in advance of an invasion, and the French and British troops would have to race to dig in.
Ah, crap. Hold on. Just go forward if you want, guys. I can't not.
Belgian troops to link along the Dial River in Belgium. This plan allowed for British, French and Belgian troops to link up with the friendly Dutch forces and defend together against the most likely route of German invasion. The biggest issue that France and Britain faced, however, was the staunch neutrality of Belgium and the Netherlands. This plan relied on total cooperation, but until Nazi Germany invaded and the Belgians and Dutch asked for support, the masses of British and French troops could do nothing but wait on the French border. It meant that the solid defensive line on the Dial could not be prepared in advance of an invasion.
Okay, I understand.
And the French and British troops would have to race to dig in.
Fall Gelb. 5:35 Uhr. Fall Gelb, 5:35 Uhr.
Just before dawn on the 10th of May 1940, hundreds of German bombers took off from airstrips across Western Germany. Their target were vital strong points, railheads, fortresses in Holland, France and Belgium. Paratroopers were dropped to secure important points, and a swarm of fighters went aloft to stop Allied spotters from looking down on a vast column of armour that was heading through Luxembourg into the Ardennes.
I guess I heard it wrong, but I thought the invasion of Normandy was the first major use of paratroopers. I clearly am wrong. I don't know where I heard that.
Im Jahr 1940 standen wir vor der Aufgabe, den Durchbruch durch die verlängerte Maginot-Linie bei Sedan zu vollziehen.
At the tip of that particular spear was General Heinz Guderian's 19th Armoured Corps, with 745 armoured fighting vehicles. Supported by Stuka dive bombers that would act as airborne artillery, sticking close to the lead tanks and delivering 250 kilos of high explosive bombs onto any enemy strongpoints. Behind them were over 41,000 other vehicles, bringing up men and supplies for the advancing army. Facing this formidable opponent, there were two French armies of infantry on this front. For the most part, they were underprepared and under-equipped. Remember, this was supposed to be a quiet sector. They had about 250 tanks, but they were parcelled out in small groups along a 60-mile front to support the infantry, making them, frankly, useless. Within 4 hours of the invasion starting, Luxembourg had been swamped and Guderian's fast armoured cars were already entering Belgium. The main break on the tempo of the advance was just the narrow roads and the sheer volume of traffic. After 24 hours, there was a queue of vehicles stretching 120 miles, and some units were yet to even leave Germany. The Luftwaffe was maintaining careful watch on the skies above, but some Allied spotter planes did get through and reported activity in the Ardennes, which Allied High Command dismissed as a feint. So far, Fall Gelb was working. On the morning of the 12th of May, 48 hours since the start of the attack, Allied resistance in the village of Bouillon on the French-Belgian border collapsed. The report says the infantry were fat and flabby 30-somethings with slack discipline. They collapsed and fled when German armoured vehicles approached from the rear. In the north, the Dutch army was fighting a desperate rearguard action as the Germans swept across the country. And in Belgium, Fort Ebenemer was one of the most modern fortresses in Europe, and yet it fell to the Nazis. The British and French needed the Belgians to hold off the Germans for several weeks to allow the Dial plan to get into action. 2 days into the attack, the Allied plan for defence was already in tatters.
It's crazy how a defeat as large as one in World War II can actually lead to your main opponent, France, being more complacent and you as Germany being more motivated. Crazy how history works like that. You'd think, it's like, how is it, like, you won World War I. You punished Germany. Germany was punished by all of the Allies very severely. And yet, they're the ones, just 2 decades later, having this much success, and the French and Allied soldiers are so unprepared. Yeah. Like, did World War I even matter? It's crazy. Obviously, they lost in the end, but at this moment, it's something to learn about.
Was already in tatters. By nightfall, lead German elements were taking up position on the River Meuse. General Rommel was at Dinant, and some of his men crept across a weir to gain a foothold on the far side. To the south, General Guderian was at Sedan. Opposite him, the French desperately brought up troops to reinforce the B-class division that was in place. They hoped the Germans would not be ready for several days to attack across the river, while they waited for their heavy guns to be dragged into place. That was wishful thinking. At 10 o'clock, the full might of the German blitzkrieg was unleashed against the French defenders at Sedan. First came 90 Stuka bombers. They attacked artillery positions. Then Dornier horizontal bombers came to pound any French defences they could find. They were joined by more Stukas who came screaming out of the sky, their sirens terrifying defenders below, raining down bombs and bullets on individual positions. It was the biggest concentration of German air power in the invasion of the West so far. 4 in the afternoon, German combat engineers dragged their heavy rafts down to the bank and began paddling across the river. Amazingly, only 56 French casualties were reported as a result of the bombardment, and most of the bunkers were still functioning. But communications were shattered, as well as the nerve of the defenders, and many fled before the German ground assault reached them. There were some pockets of resistance, but that was quickly mopped up. The defensive line on the Meuse was broken. Pontoon bridges were placed across the river and German troops swarmed across, ready to break up any French counterattacks. Despite some pockets of resistance, the French were overwhelmed. Defeat turned into rout as many of their troops threw away their weapons and fled.
I gotta ask, what happened in the interwar years, 1919 to 2039, or to 1939, that, like, what happened in the 20s and 30s that the Germans were and Hitler were able to how were they able to build up so greatly, and the Allies that won the First World War be so complacent without the Germans giving much signs that it's like, hey, Germany's building up again. So it's like, okay, maybe they were so, everyone was so shocked at World War I that you didn't want to believe it, but that would equally be the reason as why you'd be hyper-focused at it. And everyone, I'm not just saying France. France was, I think the fate that France was met with in the German invasion in World War II likely would have been the similar fate that other countries would have met if they were a large country and main allied power from World War I on the border of Germany. So this isn't just a French thing. It's like, I don't really get it. How could the Germans go so unnoticed and act like, oh, we're not doing anything? Psych, giant war.
The 14th of May would prove to be a particularly dark day for the Allies. The Luftwaffe launched a devastating bombing raid on the Dutch city of Rotterdam and effectively razed it to the ground. Fearing further appalling loss of life to the civilian population should the war continue, the Dutch government capitulated. The north flank of the Allied defences had collapsed. By now, the Allies were retreating right along the line, and Hitler at this stage became worried that the German troops were advancing too fast. They might become overextended and vulnerable to counterattack. He ordered them to slow down. But Guderian was sure that he could sniff the total collapse of the Western Allies. So, through some deception and sort of artistic interpretation of Hitler's orders,
slow down.
He kept pushing his men as hard as they could towards the Channel coast. It was the start of the breakout. On the 15th of May 1940,
obviously.
the new British Prime Minister Winston Churchill received a call from the French Premier, Paul Reynaud. He said, "We are defeated. We are beaten. We have lost the battle." Churchill desperately tried to rally his opposite number, reminding him of the defence of Paris in 1914 when all seemed lost. Nevertheless, Churchill, who'd been Prime Minister for just 5 days...
1914? I thought he was making a Napoleonic reference.
Nevertheless,
He was making a World War I reference.
reminding him of the defence of Paris in 1914 when all seemed lost. Nevertheless, Churchill, who'd been Prime Minister for just 5 days, took the decision to get to France as soon as possible. On the 16th of May, Churchill flew to Paris to meet Rhode and senior French commanders like General Maurice Gamelin. Churchill realised immediately something was not right. The French were burning their papers and getting ready to flee from Paris. Churchill said to Gamelin, "Where is your strategic reserve?" And Gamelin replied, "Aucune." There is none. Churchill later described it as one of the most shocking moments of his life.
So was this, like, was there just so much political and public outrage at any semblance of losing the amount of people that they did in World War I, and so that, like, the politicians had to kind of curt that line and not really, and just be like, yeah, no one wants it, and the Germans were the only one who had a gripe in that, you know, they felt they were treated badly in Versailles, and they lost World War I. They're the only ones that, like, all right, we want to fight, but every other country is just, I'm sure, like, saying everything to their politicians, like anything but repeating that. I keep bringing this up, but just because it's a point I would love to understand.
Churchill asked where the Allies would launch a counterattack. He got the reply, inferiority of numbers, inferiority of equipment, inferiority of methods. The French deployed their best units in the north against the German advance into Belgium. They were now hundreds of miles away from Guderian's hammer.
Sorry, I just want to say one more thing. Sorry, quick. Is that it's not just the Ardennes, okay? You could say, like, oh, well, they thought it was impenetrable. The Germans had a belief that they could get through it, and they made a good idea of going through Belgium and the Netherlands first, act like World War I and bait them in there, and you lost that. Like, that's one thing. But to have no reserve troops at all, like when Churchill called, and to have a lot of soldiers who were not, like, young, early 20, late teens, young, fit men, but a lot of, like, 30-year-olds, it's like, what caused that to happen? How was it possible? It's like the Allies were like, well, war's never going to happen again. You know, the only important thing is to please the public and whoever, to show that, like, we're never getting into that again. Which is different if you're a country like the USA, which is also caught off guard, right? But where you're not immediately threatened by this force. France is. And I just need to understand what happened. Why it's not just the Ardennes and that good maneuvering and bait tactic, but what happened?
Where are unable to do anything all the forces? About the German breakout. Charles de Gaulle, leading the French 4th Armoured Division, did have some success while using his tanks as a concentrated unit, causing the German advance to slow, but ultimately he too would be overwhelmed. By the 19th of May, the Germans were on the move again. They smashed through two fairly weak British Territorial Army divisions on the Somme, and the following day, the reconnaissance unit of the 2nd Panzer Division reached Noyelles-sur-Mer. The German army was on the Channel coast. The noose was tightening round the neck of the British and French. The Allies were now in disarray. They were desperate to break out of the pocket the Germans had created, but communications between the nations was breaking down. The French launched an attack at Cambrai. Unbeknown to them, the British launched one at Arras. Despite some initial successes, they too were unable to break through German lines. On the 23rd of May, Lord Gort, head of the British Expeditionary Force in France, ordered a retreat from Arras and made the decision to head to the Channel ports. They needed to escape. For the British troops trapped in this enclave, it was now a matter of survival. Guderian was still acting against the spirit of commands he was receiving from higher up. They were telling him to slow down, but he could sense that British defeat was imminent. He wanted to try and encircle, perhaps capture intact the entire BEF. On the 25th of May, Boulogne fell. The following day, the 26th, it was Calais' turn. All British efforts were now directed at protecting the last of the Channel ports. On the evening of the 26th of May, Winston Churchill ordered the evacuation of the BEF from Europe, using the port of Dunkirk. It was the start of Operation Dynamo. For a week, the Allies poured into the area around Dunkirk. Hundreds of thousands of men of the BEF and the French army went down onto the beaches and were picked up by vessels of all kinds. Thames steamers, pleasure boats, and ferries that had heeded the call of the Royal Navy to get the men back to the safety of
Crazy. Non-military
Churchill, the
vessels
British High
too.
Command, had expected they might be able to evacuate around 45,000 men from the port. But the sacrificial efforts of the French, British and Belgian troops to slow the German advance, and the heroic efforts of the Royal Navy, meant that almost 350,000 men were saved.
Yeah, it's a military defeat and a bad one, but what a victory in recovering the troops from that defeat. And you can absolutely celebrate that and praise that, even the fact that it being the result of a big loss. It's incredible.
It was a humiliating retreat for the Allies. Belgium was forced to surrender. The British and French, who had managed to escape, had to leave behind most of their equipment, guns, ammunition, supplies, and vehicles. And hundreds of thousands of men, including the best French units, had been killed or were captured by the Germans. Once the pocket on the Channel coast had been stamped out, the Germans could turn their attention to the rest of the French army. This
Can't imagine being a French soldier captured in that scenario, and now you have to spend like half a decade or like 5 years or so being like, what the hell just happened? We're prisoners of war right now? What? And to have to like, oh, that must have been mental anguish. And I just want to say before I continue, how this will be my kind of closing point, actually. Never mind.
had been stamped out, the Germans could turn their attention to the rest of the French army. This next phase they called Fall Rot, Case Red. General Weygand didn't think that he could match the German army right across the line, so instead he decided to turn towns and villages into individual strong points, like breakwaters, hoping to slow the spread of the German advance. The French use of their armour slowly improved. They were able to slow the Germans down this time, but it was the Germans' all-arms attack, including their Luftwaffe, which simply overwhelmed the French ability to withstand them. On the 10th of June, Paris was declared an open city, and on the 14th, the German army marched into the French capital. The German army marched on, surrounding the fortresses of the Maginot Line, causing them to surrender and pushing further and further south into France. On the 16th of June, the French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud resigned his position. He was replaced by Marshal Philippe Pétain. He immediately announced his intention to sign an armistice with the Germans.
Man, 20 years going. He was an amazing general in the First World War, right? And to go from that to just complete opposite.
As soon as he heard that the French government wanted,
he brought the same
an
train
armistice,
car.
Hitler knew that he would drag them to the forest of Compiègne, where
This is one of the craziest moments in history for any single person, in my opinion. Imagine like being a soldier in World War I and losing. Your country loses, and then you become chancellor, and you become in charge and get like total power, and then you go to war against that exact country, and you beat it very quickly, and then you bring the train car that was brought that the Germans signed their surrender in, and you brought it and had the French go into that car, and you walk in and throw the surrender papers on the table and walk out. That must have been the most insane experience that any single one individual ever had, right? And as evil as he is and how the Nazis and Germans were, you can't deny that moment must have been like one of the largest elations that anyone has ever experienced. Crazy.
In November 1918, the exhausted German army had agreed to the armistice that had ended fighting in the First World War. In fact, he went one step further. He forced the French delegation into the same railway carriage that the Germans had signed that fateful document in. The French agreed and signed. Fighting finished on the morning of the 25th of June 1940. The fall of France was complete. France was carved in two, with the occupied north and the so-called free zone of Vichy France in the south.
My God, I can't imagine that.
And what now began was 4 terrifying years as the French people had to survive beneath the yoke of Nazism. By the end of June, Britain and its empire were standing alone against Nazi Germany. It would only be a matter of time before British people in communities right across the country would feel the might of German assault. As Winston Churchill famously said in his finest hour speech,
"What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin."
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out.
You're gonna love it.
Or if you are a true
Ready?
history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're gonna love it. Dedicated.
Okay. I'm gonna rephrase the question I've already asked twice. Okay? But it's so important that I understand, that I would love to understand this. How were you so caught off guard? So, let me go here. I kind of thought of an answer to the question, my own question. I'll just see if you guys agree. I'm wondering if, if you are a very motivated dictator in a non-democratic society, right? As Hitler became in Germany. My only guess is that, countries like France, which has a long tradition of democracy, the longest tradition of democracy, maybe. Well, anyways, is that my only get? If I asked, I would love to go back and just ask in the interwar years, or just view, just like, what are your thoughts right now? Obviously, they don't know Germany is going to attack and start World War II, but I really would love to know if they would say, well, it's not likely to happen. They were defeated here, and so we don't have to commit that much. Either that, or, well, we know they're a threat and they need to be tackled, but we live in it. You have to, in rules of a democracy, you have to, you have to be careful about, losing your job, and knowing that you can't just be like, okay, Germany is a threat, therefore beef up defense. You have to go through political channels and get money for that and get approval. And so I get that. And so maybe it was just a combination of disbelief that Germany could do that so quickly, and having to deal with a democratic society and government, bureaucracy, where your opponent just, whatever he decides goes, happens. He doesn't have to worry about public dissent and minority parties gaining power or something like that. You don't have to think about that. Obviously, dictatorships, autocracies, not pleasant. Wouldn't like to go there. And democracies, are, in my opinion, are much better. But you have to realize the weaknesses that come along with the democracy, just as they have to realize their own weaknesses in more autocratic political systems, governments. But you need to realize that, okay, look at the dangers around you. I can't just say, okay, well, don't be democratic sometimes. It doesn't work like that. But you have to recognize your shortcomings. and that they can just invade if they want to invade, but you need to get up your own defense and political maneuvers and going through bureaucracy. I get that. But again, I would love to know what the thoughts on the possibility of a German conflict was in the 20s and then in the early 30s, mid to late 30s. We'd love to know the answer to that question. Yeah. Love you all. Hope you guys are all doing well. Would appreciate any answers to any of the questions I had. Any comments at all. You're always so great with that. Hopefully I'll see you guys next video. Wow, that was a great video.